The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup of tea that had grown cold in her grasp. The news had arrived just hours before dawn, delivered by a somber-faced private secretary who spoke in hushed tones that seemed to echo through the corridors of their Kensington Palace apartment. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 101. The patriarch of the royal family, the man who had stood steadfastly beside Queen Elizabeth for over 7 decades, was gone. William entered the room quietly, his usually composed demeanor cracked with grief. His grandfather had been more than just a royal duty to him. Philip had been a mentor, a source of wisdom, and perhaps most importantly, the one person who understood the weight of serving the crown while maintaining one's own identity. "The children know," William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Georgia asked if Gangan would be very sad. I told him yes, but that we would all take care of her." Catherine turned from the window, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She had learned much about royal protocol in her years as a member of the family, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The loss felt personal and public simultaneously, a grief that belonged to them as a family but also to an entire nation. The phone had been ringing constantly since the announcement. Palace officials coordinated with government ministers, media outlets prepared special broadcasts, and across the Commonwealth, flags began their solemn descent to half-mast. Yet in this quiet moment between husband and wife, the magnitude of the loss felt almost too large to comprehend. "We need to go to her," Catherine said, referring to the Queen. Elizabeth had lost not just her husband, but her anchor, her constant companion through decades of public service. The thought of the 95-year-old monarch facing this grief alone was unbearable. William nodded, already mentally preparing for the days ahead. There would be protocols to follow, ceremonies to arrange, and a grieving nation to comfort. But first there was family. His grandmother would need them now more than ever, though he knew she would never ask for support. It wasn't the royal way. As they prepared to leave for Windsor Castle, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked pale, shocked, but there was something else there too, a resolve that had been building since she first married into this extraordinary family. She had promised to serve, to support, to stand beside William through whatever challenges the crown might bring. Today that promise would be tested like never before. The drive to Windsor was unusually quiet. Their protection officers maintained professional silence while William and Catherine sat hand in hand in the back seat, each lost in their own memories of Philip. Catherine remembered his sharp wit during family dinners, the way his eyes would twinkle when he teased the younger royals, and his surprising gentleness with her children. When they arrived at Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was subdued but purposeful. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, their faces reflecting the same mixture of grief and duty that seemed to permeate every corner of the royal residences. The Queen's private secretary met them at the entrance, his usual crisp demeanor softened by genuine sorrow. "Her Majesty is in her private sitting room," he informed them. "She's been there since early this morning going through some of the Duke's personal effects." The walk to the Queen's private quarters felt longer than usual. Catherine found herself thinking about the woman they were about to see, not as the monarch, but as a wife who had just lost her partner of more than 70 years. How does one comfort a person who has spent her entire life comforting others? When they entered the sitting room, they found Elizabeth seated in her favorite armchair, a small collection of photographs spread across the table before her. She looked up as they entered, her expression composed but her eyes betraying the depth of her grief. "William, Catherine," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Catherine moved forward first, her natural warmth overriding royal protocol as she gently embraced her grandmother-in-law. For just a moment, Elizabeth allowed herself to lean into the comfort offered, her carefully maintained composure wavering ever so slightly. "We're here for whatever you need." "Granny," William said, using the private family name he had called her since childhood, "the children send their love. Charlotte made you a drawing this morning when we told her about great-grandpapa." A small smile crossed Elizabeth's face at the mention of her great-granddaughter. The children had always been a source of joy for both her and Philip, representing hope for the future of the monarchy and the simple pleasure of family life. He was so proud of them, Elizabeth said quietly, her gaze returning to the photographs before her. Just last week he was asking about George's cricket matches and whether Lewis had started walking properly yet. The three of them sat together in the comfortable silence that comes between family members who don't need words to communicate their support. Outside, the world was already beginning to respond to the news of Philip's death. Television schedules had been cleared, newspapers were preparing special editions, and world leaders were composing statements of condolence. But in this room, in this moment, they were simply a grandmother, her grandson and his wife bound together by love and loss, preparing to face the days ahead as a family. The weight of their public roles would demand much of them in the coming weeks, but for now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. The next morning brought with it the harsh reality of public duty intertwined with private grief. Catherine woke early in one of Windsor Castle's guest bedrooms, having stayed overnight to be close to the Queen. Through the ancient windows, she could see the grounds below already bustling with activity, as preparations began for what would become one of the most significant royal events in recent memory. William was already awake, dressed in a dark suit, speaking quietly on his phone with palace officials. The careful choreography of royal mourning had begun, a delicate balance between honoring tradition and acknowledging the unique circumstances of a pandemic-affected world. Every detail would be scrutinized, every gesture analyzed, yet somehow they needed to find space within all the protocol for genuine human emotion. The Prime Minister will be here within the hour, William informed her as he ended his call, and representatives from all the Commonwealth realms are requesting audiences with Granny. The Archbishop of Canterbury is flying back from his retreat. Catherine nodded, understanding that these next few hours would set the tone for everything that followed. She had learned from her years in the royal family that public mourning was both deeply personal and entirely performative. The nation would look to them for guidance on how to process this loss, while they themselves were still reeling from it. When they joined the Queen for breakfast, she appeared transformed from the grieving widow of the night before into the composed monarch the world expected to see. Her black dress was impeccably tailored, her jewelry carefully chosen, and her bearing regal despite the circumstances. Yet Catherine noticed the way Elizabeth's hand shook slightly as she lifted her teacup, the only outward sign of the storm of emotion beneath the surface. The funeral arrangements, Elizabeth began without preamble, her voice steady and businesslike. Philip left very specific instructions. He wanted something simpler than Charles or I will eventually have. No lying in state, no large procession through London. A service at St. George's Chapel here at Windsor. Military honors befitting his naval service and family only. William exchanged a glance with Catherine. They both knew that family only in royal terms still meant a carefully curated guest list that would need to balance personal relationships with diplomatic necessity. Every invitation or exclusion would be analyzed by the press and foreign governments alike. The guest list will be challenging, Catherine observed gently. There will be many who expect to attend. Elizabeth's expression hardened slightly. Philip was very clear about his wishes. This is not a state occasion, it is a family farewell. We will honor his desires, regardless of what others might expect. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the private secretary, who brought with him a stack of draft statements, ceremonial protocols, and urgent messages from world leaders. Catherine watched as the Queen transformed once again, this time into the head of state who had guided the nation through decades of change and challenge. Over the next several hours, the sitting room became an impromptu command center. Maps of the castle grounds were spread across tables as security experts planned routes and positions. Guest lists were drafted, revised, and refined. Catherine found herself drawn into discussions about everything, from the musical selections to the precise timing of the military salutes. What struck her most was how naturally William stepped into his role as support for his grandmother. She watched him field calls from other royal family members, each dealing with their own grief while trying to navigate the complex family dynamics that would inevitably surface during such an emotional time. His Uncle Andrew wanted a more prominent role in the ceremonies. His Aunt Anne insisted on representing their father's naval connections. His father Charles was flying back from Scotland with specific ideas about the service. Everyone grieves differently, William explained to Catherine during a brief break. And everyone wants to honor Grandpapa in their own way. The challenge is making sure it remains his funeral, not theirs. As the day progressed, Catherine began to understand the unique burden that Elizabeth carried. The Queen was not only mourning her husband but also managing the grief and expectations of an entire family, a nation, and the Commonwealth realms. Every decision she made would be questioned. Every protocol she followed or broke would be remembered for generations. When the children's tutors arrived with George, Charlotte, and Louis, the atmosphere in the castle shifted perceptibly. The presence of the young royals brought a different energy, one that seemed to lift some of the weight from Elizabeth's shoulders. She had always been more relaxed with her great-grandchildren, more willing to let her guard down and simply be a great-grandmother, rather than a queen. "Will there be soldiers at great-grandpapa's funeral?" George asked with the direct curiosity of a 7-year-old who was beginning to understand that his family was different from others. "Yes, darling," Elizabeth replied, kneeling down to his level with a tenderness that few outside the family ever witnessed. "Your great-grandfather was a very important sailor, and sailors will come to say goodbye to him." Catherine felt her throat tighten as she watched the interaction. This was the woman behind the crown, the great-grandmother who would always make time for a child's questions even in the midst of national mourning. It was a side of Elizabeth that the public rarely saw, but one that Catherine had come to deeply respect and love. As evening approached and the children were taken back to their own homes, the 3 adults found themselves alone again. The day had been a whirlwind of decisions, protocols, and preparations, but now the reality of loss settled over them once more. "He would have hated all this fuss," Elizabeth said with a slight smile as she looked at the papers scattered around the room. Philip always preferred things simple and straightforward. No unnecessary ceremony, no pompous speeches. William laughed softly. "I remember him telling me once that the best royal events were the ones that ended on time and didn't give people indigestion." For the first time since receiving the news of Philip's death, all 3 of them shared a moment of genuine laughter. It was exactly the kind of irreverent comment that Philip would have made, delivered with his characteristic blend of humor and practicality. In that moment, Catherine realized that perhaps the best way to honor his memory was not through perfect protocol or flawless ceremony, but through the love and laughter he had brought to their lives. The 3rd day after Philip's death brought unexpected challenges that tested the royal family's ability to balance tradition with the realities of a modern world. Catherine found herself at the center of a delicate diplomatic situation when the guest list for the funeral became a source of international tension. 30 people, William explained as they walked through the castle gardens early that morning. "Due to pandemic restrictions, we can only have 30 people at the service. Do you realize how impossible it is to narrow down a guest list for the Duke of Edinburgh to 30 people? Catherine understood the magnitude of the problem. Philip had been patron or president of over 800 organizations. He had served in the Royal Navy for decades, had relationships with heads of state around the world, and was connected to royal families across Europe. Choosing who could attend his funeral from such a vast network of relationships seemed almost cruel. The Mourning's crisis had erupted when several Commonwealth prime ministers expressed dismay at being excluded from the service, while distant European royals remained on the preliminary list. The delicate balance between family, duty, and diplomacy had never felt more precarious. The Australian Prime Minister called at 6 this morning, Elizabeth informed them when they returned from their walk. Her tone was measured, but Catherine could see the strain beginning to show in the tight lines around her eyes. "He wanted me to understand that Philip held a special place in the hearts of the Australian people, as he did with the Canadians, the New Zealanders, and every other Commonwealth nation," William replied gently. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Grandpapa meant something to everyone." Catherine watched the exchange with growing admiration for how Elizabeth handled each challenge. The Queen listened to every concern, acknowledged every relationship, but remained firm in her commitment to honoring Philip's wishes for a small, family-focused ceremony. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure. The tension was broken by an unexpected arrival. Princess Anne, Philip's only daughter, came striding into the room with her characteristic no-nonsense demeanor. She had been at her father's bedside in his final days and carried herself with the particular grief of someone who had said goodbye. "I've been dealing with reporters camped outside Gatcombe," Anne announced without preamble. "They want to know if I'll be giving interviews about Papa's naval service. I told them the family speaks through actions, not words." Catherine had always respected Anne's direct approach to royal duty, but she found herself particularly grateful for it now. Anne's presence seemed to strengthen Elizabeth's resolve and reminded everyone that this was, first and foremost, about a father, grandfather, and great-grandfather who was loved and would be deeply missed. "The children have been asking questions," Catherine shared during a quiet moment with Anne. "George wants to know if great-grandpapa's spirit can still watch his cricket matches. Charlotte asked if he can still hear her when she plays piano." Anne's expression softened. "He adored them, you know. Used to tell me that George had the makings of a fine sailor, and that Charlotte reminded him of Granny at that age, full of determination and mischief." These conversations about Philip's relationship with the children brought a warmth to the proceedings that Catherine found deeply moving. Despite all the protocol and public pressure, at its heart this was about a family saying goodbye to someone they loved. The afternoon brought another unexpected challenge when Harry called from California. The conversation with William was tense and emotional, conducted in hushed tones in a private study while Catherine and Elizabeth remained in the main sitting room. When William returned, his face was pale and his expression troubled. "He's flying back," William said simply. "He'll quarantine as required and be here for the funeral." The implications were enormous. Harry's return would inevitably bring media attention to the family tensions that had been playing out in public over recent months. Catherine felt a familiar knot form in her stomach at the thought of navigating those complicated dynamics while trying to support both William and Elizabeth through their grief. "Family first," Elizabeth said firmly, as if reading Catherine's thoughts. "Whatever differences there may be, this is about honoring Philip. He would expect nothing less than for his family to come together." As the day progressed, Catherine found herself taking on an increasingly important role as a bridge between different family members and their varying approaches to grief. She fielded calls from Camilla, who was supporting Charles as he dealt with his own complex relationship with his father's death. She coordinated with Sophie, Edward's wife, who was managing the practical aspects of the children's attendance at the funeral. What emerged was a picture of a family that, despite their public roles and personal differences, were united in their love for Philip and their determination to honor him properly. Catherine began to see how her own position as William's wife and the future queen consort placed her at a unique intersection of these relationships. That evening, as they prepared for another night at Windsor, Catherine received a call that surprised her. It was from one of Philip's longtime private secretaries, who wanted to share some of the Duke's final wishes that weren't part of the official funeral arrangements. "His Royal Highness wanted you to know," the secretary said, his voice thick with emotion, "that he thought you had brought something special to the family. He said you understood that duty and love weren't separate things but parts of the same whole." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. Throughout her years in the royal family, she had sometimes felt uncertain about whether she truly belonged, whether she understood the weight of the responsibilities she had inherited through marriage. To know that Philip, in his final days, had seen and valued her contributions felt like a gift she hadn't expected. When she shared this conversation with William later that night, he took her hand and looked at her with an expression of deep love and gratitude. "He was right," William said softly. "You do understand. And more than that, you've helped me understand it too. This family, this institution we serve, it only means something because of the love that holds it together." As they fell asleep that night in the guest room at Windsor Castle, Catherine felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. The days ahead would be challenging, the funeral would be emotionally devastating, and the family dynamics would require careful navigation. But she knew now with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The day before the funeral dawned gray and somber, perfectly matching the mood that had settled over Windsor Castle. Catherine woke to find William already gone from their bed, called away early for final security briefings and last-minute protocol adjustments. The weight of the approaching ceremony seemed to press down on everyone in the castle, from the most senior royals to the kitchen staff. She found Elizabeth in the chapel, having arrived before anyone else to spend a few private moments in the space where Philip's service would take place. The Queen sat in the front pew, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the altar where her husband's coffin would rest in just 24 hours. Catherine hesitated at the chapel entrance, unsure whether to intrude on what was clearly a deeply personal moment. But Elizabeth turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the vulnerable expression on her face made Catherine's heart ache. "I keep expecting him to walk through those doors," Elizabeth said quietly. 73 years of marriage, and I still can't quite believe he won't be coming back from one of his walks around the grounds. Catherine moved to sit beside her mother-in-law, offering the silent companionship she sensed was needed. The chapel felt different this morning, charged with anticipation and heavy with grief. Tomorrow it would be filled with carefully chosen guests, television cameras, and the weight of global attention. Today it was simply a sacred space where a wife could begin to say goodbye. "William told me what you said about duty, and love being the same thing," Catherine said gently. "I've been thinking about that. About how Philip understood that serving something bigger than yourself is actually an act of love." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "He never saw his role as a sacrifice. Even when it was difficult, even when the protocols seemed senseless or the public criticism felt unfair, he understood that love sometimes means putting others' needs before your own, and he did that every day for this family and this country." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other family members, each coming to the chapel for their own private moments of reflection. Charles arrived first, looking older than his years, the weight of losing a father evident in every line of his face. Anne followed, efficient and composed, but with red-rimmed eyes that spoke to her private grief. When Harry arrived with his protection officers, the atmosphere in the chapel shifted perceptibly. Catherine felt the tension immediately, not just between the brothers, but in the very air around them. Too much had been said in public, too many wounds opened, for this reunion to be easy despite the circumstances. "Harry," William said simply, acknowledging his brother with a nod that was formal rather than warm. "William," Harry replied, his own voice carefully neutral. Catherine watched Elizabeth's face during this exchange and saw a flash of pain that went deeper than her grief for Philip. The Queen was witnessing the fracture in the family's next generation. The sons who had once been inseparable now struggling to be civil to each other at their grandfather's funeral. Moving instinctively, Catherine stepped forward to embrace Harry, breaking through some of the awkwardness with genuine warmth. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, and meant it. Whatever their differences, this was family, and Philip would have wanted them all present. The afternoon was spent in final rehearsals and preparations. Catherine found herself coordinating between different family members, each with their own needs and concerns. Camilla needed reassurance about her role in the procession. Sophie was managing her children's questions about death and grief. The cousins were arriving from across Europe, each bringing their own cultural expectations about royal mourning. What struck Catherine most was how the practical aspects of preparing for the funeral became a way for the family to process their grief together. Discussing the order of the procession, the placement of flowers, the timing of the music, these details gave them concrete tasks to focus on while their emotions remained too raw to address directly. When the children arrived for a final visit, with their great-grandmother, the atmosphere shifted again. George, Charlotte, and Louis brought an energy that seemed to lift some of the heavy sorrow that had settled over the castle. Catherine watched as Elizabeth's face brightened when Charlotte presented her with a hand-drawn picture of Philip in his naval uniform. "Great-grandpapa looks very smart," Elizabeth observed, studying the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "I drew him with his medals because Mama said he was very brave," Charlotte explained with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 6-year-old. "He was indeed very brave," Elizabeth agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "And he would be very proud of this beautiful picture." As evening approached, Catherine realized that this day of preparation had been as important as the funeral itself would be. It had allowed the family to come together, to share their grief, and to begin the process of supporting each other through the difficult days ahead. The final challenge came when they gathered for a private family dinner in the castle's smaller dining room. 30 people around one table, representing the guest list for tomorrow's service, each carrying their own relationship with Philip and their own way of processing loss. Catherine found herself seated between William and one of Philip's German relatives, tasked with facilitating conversation between family members who hadn't seen each other in years. The dinner was both intensely formal and deeply personal, with stories shared about Philip's humor, his dedication, and his love for his family. When Harry rose to make an impromptu toast to their grandfather, Catherine held her breath. The room fell silent as he spoke about Philip's influence on his life, his gratitude for the values he had learned from the Duke, and his commitment to honoring that legacy despite the geographical distance that now separated him from the family. It wasn't a reconciliation between the brothers, but it was a reminder that their shared love for Philip transcended their current differences. As the evening concluded and family members began to retire to their rooms, Catherine felt a cautious optimism about the day ahead. William found her on the terrace later that night, looking out over the castle grounds where Philip had walked countless times over the decades of his marriage to Elizabeth. "Tomorrow is going to be one of the hardest days she's ever faced," William said, referring to his grandmother. "But I think she's stronger than any of us realize, and I think Grandpapa would be proud of how she's handling this." Catherine nodded, thinking about the grace and dignity Elizabeth had shown throughout these difficult days. "She's teaching us all how to grieve with purpose, how to honor someone's life through the way we say goodbye." As they prepared to return inside for their final night before the funeral, Catherine felt the weight of tomorrow settling over them. But she also felt ready, supported by the love of family and guided by the example Philip himself had set for how to serve with dedication and love. The morning of Philip's funeral arrived with crisp April sunshine that seemed almost inappropriate for such a solemn occasion. Catherine woke early, her mind immediately focused on the day ahead and her role in supporting both William and the Queen through what would undoubtedly be the most emotionally challenging day since Philip's death. The castle was alive with quiet activity from before dawn. Security personnel conducted final sweeps, florists made last-minute adjustments to the carefully chosen arrangements, and television crews prepared for broadcasts that would reach millions around the world. Yet despite all the external preparations, Catherine's attention was focused entirely on the family and how they would navigate this final farewell. She found William in their bathroom, struggling with his black tie, his hands shaking slightly from emotion rather than nerves. After years of public appearances, royal protocols were second nature to him. But today the familiar routines felt weighted with significance that made even simple tasks more difficult. "Let me," Catherine said gently, taking over the tie and smoothing it into place. As she worked, she could see the grief in his eyes that he was working so hard to keep controlled for the sake of his family and the watching world. "I keep thinking about the last conversation I had with him," William said quietly. 3 weeks ago, we talked about George's school project on naval history. Grandpapa was so pleased that George had chosen to write about the Battle of Jutland. He said it showed the boy had good instincts for history." Catherine finished with the tie and rested her hands on William's shoulders. "He was proud of all of you, of the father you've become, the way you've embraced your role, the family you're building. He told me so himself. When they made their way to Elizabeth's private apartments, they found her already dressed in black, wearing the diamond brooch that Philip had given her as a wedding gift 74 years earlier. She sat at her dressing table while her dresser made final adjustments to her hat, the picture of royal composure despite the magnitude of the day ahead. "Granny," William said softly as they entered, "how are you feeling this morning?" Elizabeth turned to face them, and Catherine was struck by the strength she saw there. Grief was present in every line of the Queen's face, but so was determination and a kind of peaceful resolution that spoke to her deep faith and her understanding of duty. "Ready," Elizabeth said simply. "Philip would expect nothing less than for us to do this properly, with dignity and love. I intend to honor that expectation." The next hour passed in a carefully choreographed sequence of arrivals and preparations. Family members gathered in the castle's state apartments, each dressed in formal mourning attire, each carrying their own private grief while preparing to share their farewell with the world. Catherine watched as the dynamics between different family members played out in these final moments. Charles stood with Camilla, both of them looking older and more fragile than she had ever seen them. Anne remained the picture of military precision, but Catherine noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. When Harry arrived for the final family gathering before the service, the tension between the brothers was still present, but seemed muted by the gravity of the occasion. They spoke briefly and formally, but there was no open hostility. Just the sad distance of two men who had once been best friends and were now struggling to find their way back to each other. "The children won't attend," Catherine explained to Elizabeth when asked about George, Charlotte, and Louis. "We felt they were too young for the formal ceremony, but they wanted to contribute something." She handed Elizabeth 3 small envelopes, each containing a drawing and a handwritten note from the great-grandchildren. As Elizabeth opened them, Catherine saw tears gathering in her eyes for the first time since Philip's death. "George wrote that great-grandpapa was the best sailor in the whole world," Elizabeth read aloud. "Charlotte says she will miss his funny jokes." And Louis drew a picture of Philip's favorite flowers from the garden. The walk to St. George's Chapel felt both eternal and far too short. Catherine walked behind Elizabeth and Charles, watching the Queen's straight back and measured steps, amazed by her composure. The chapel was filled with the carefully chosen 30 guests, each representing a different aspect of Philip's remarkable life. As they took their places for the service, Catherine was struck by how small and intimate the gathering felt, despite the global significance of the moment. This wasn't the grand state funeral that many had expected, but rather exactly what Philip had wanted: a family saying goodbye to someone they loved. The service itself was a perfect reflection of Philip's character. The music he had chosen was dignified but not overly somber. The readings spoke to duty, service, and faith without unnecessary grandeur. When the Dean of Windsor spoke about Philip's life of service, Catherine felt the truth of those words in every heart present. What moved her most was watching Elizabeth throughout the service. The Queen sat alone due to pandemic restrictions, a small figure in black in the front pew, but her bearing was regal despite her solitude. When Philip's naval cap and sword were placed on his coffin, Catherine saw Elizabeth's lips move in what might have been a prayer, or perhaps a final private farewell. The moment that would stay with Catherine forever came during the final hymn. As voices joined together in Eternal Father Strong to Save, the naval hymn that had special meaning for Philip, she glanced around the chapel and saw tears on faces that rarely showed such emotion in public. Charles wept openly. Anne's composure finally cracked, and even Harry and William seemed to find some common ground in their shared grief. When the last post sounded, and Philip's coffin was slowly lowered into the royal vault, Catherine felt a profound sense of finality. This remarkable man, who had dedicated his life to supporting the woman he loved and the institution she represented, was being laid to rest with the dignity and love he deserved. As they left the chapel, Elizabeth paused at the door and looked back one final time. Catherine understood that this was more than just the end of a funeral service. It was the end of an era, the close of a remarkable partnership that had sustained the monarchy through decades of change and challenge. Walking back to the castle, supporting Elizabeth on one side while William took the other, Catherine felt the weight of the future settling on all of them. Philip was gone, but the work he had championed, the family he had helped build, and the values he had embodied would continue, and they would carry that legacy forward together, united by love and strengthened by the example he had set. 3 weeks after the funeral, Catherine found herself walking through the same Windsor Castle gardens where she had spent those intense days supporting Elizabeth and William through their grief. The castle felt different now, quieter somehow, as if Philip's absence had changed the very atmosphere of the place he had called home for so many decades. The immediate crisis of the funeral preparations had passed, but the deeper work of adjusting to life without Philip was only just beginning. Catherine had watched Elizabeth navigate this transition with the same grace and determination she brought to everything else, but she could see the toll it was taking on the 95-year-old monarch. "She's been spending a lot of time going through his papers," William explained as they walked the same path Philip had taken for his daily constitutional.
"His private secretary says she's determined to personally review everything,
to make sure his charitable work continues and his projects are properly transferred to other family members." Catherine nodded, understanding that this methodical approach to settling Philip's affairs was Elizabeth's way of processing her grief while ensuring his legacy remained intact. It was so typical of both of them, this focus on duty and service even in the midst of personal loss. They found Elizabeth in Philip's study, surrounded by boxes of correspondence, photographs, and documents that chronicled his 70 years of royal service. She looked up as they entered, and Catherine was relieved to see that while sadness remained in her eyes, there was also a kind of peaceful purpose that suggested she was finding her way through the grief. "I've been reading through some of the letters he received over the years," Elizabeth told them, gesturing to the papers spread across the desk. "From young people who were inspired by the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, from organizations he supported, from people whose lives he touched in small but meaningful ways." She picked up one particular letter, handling it with the care reserved for something precious. "This is from a young man who wrote to thank Philip for encouraging him during a difficult period. He said that a 5-minute conversation with the Duke changed the entire direction of his life." Catherine felt her throat tighten as she listened. This was the Philip that the public had only glimpsed, the man behind the formal titles who had genuinely cared about making a difference in individual lives. These letters were testament to a lifetime of service that went far beyond ceremonial appearances and state dinners. "William has agreed to take over the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme," Elizabeth continued, looking at her grandson with obvious pride. "Philip was very specific about wanting the work to continue, and he felt William understood the importance of inspiring young people to challenge themselves. William accepted this responsibility with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that he was inheriting more than just another royal patronage. The award scheme had been Philip's personal passion project, something he had created and nurtured for decades. Taking it on meant committing to Philip's vision of empowering young people to discover their own potential. "The children have been asking about him," Catherine shared during a quiet moment. "George wants to know if great-grandpapa can still see him when he's sailing his little boat on the pond. Charlotte keeps setting a place for him at tea parties with her dolls." Elizabeth's expression softened as it always did when the conversation turned to her great-grandchildren. "Grief is different for children," she observed. "They understand loss in their own way, but they also have a natural resilience that adults sometimes forget they possess." Over the following days, Catherine found herself taking on an increasingly important role in helping the family navigate their new reality. She coordinated between different royal households, ensuring that Philip's various charitable commitments were properly transferred and that his staff were supported during the transition. It was delicate work that required both practical organization and emotional sensitivity. The most challenging aspect was watching Elizabeth adjust to being alone after 7 decades of partnership. Catherine noticed small changes in the Queen's routine, the way she would pause before making decisions that she had always discussed with Philip, the way she looked toward his empty chair during family gatherings. "She's stronger than any of us realized," William observed one evening as they prepared to return to Kensington Palace after another day at Windsor. "But I worry about her carrying all of this alone." Catherine understood his concern. Elizabeth had always been the focal point of the family, the steady center around which everyone else orbited. But Philip had been her anchor, her advisor, her constant companion. Learning to fulfill that role without his support would be one of the greatest challenges of her long reign. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a visit from the great-grandchildren. Charlotte, with the directness that only a 6-year-old could manage, asked her great-grandmother why she looked sad even when she was smiling. "Because I miss great-grandpapa very much," Elizabeth answered honestly. "When you love someone for a very long time, missing them is part of how you keep loving them." Charlotte considered this with the gravity that children bring to important concepts. "Mama says that people we love never really go away because we carry them in our hearts. Is great-grandpapa in your heart, Gangan?" "Yes, darling," Elizabeth replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He's in my heart and he always will be." Catherine watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, understanding that Charlotte had given Elizabeth something that all the royal protocols and formal condolences could not provide: permission to grieve openly and honestly, and reassurance that love persists beyond physical presence. In the months that followed, Catherine saw Elizabeth gradually find her footing in this new phase of her life. The Queen began taking on some of the patronages that had been Philip's, determined to ensure that his work continued. She started spending more time with family, particularly the great-grandchildren, seeming to draw strength from their energy and unconditional love. The family itself began to heal as well. Harry's presence at the funeral had opened a door, and while the relationship between the brothers remained complicated, there were tentative signs of communication and mutual concern. Catherine found herself often serving as a bridge, facilitating conversations and helping to rebuild connections that had been damaged by misunderstanding and hurt. Philip would have wanted us to support each other, Elizabeth said during one family gathering. He believed that family was the foundation of everything else we do. Our duty to the country, our service to the Commonwealth, our work with charities and organizations, all of it rests on the strength of the bonds between us. As Catherine reflected on the weeks since Philip's death, she realized that they had all been changed by the experience of losing him and saying goodbye. The grief had been profound, but it had also strengthened their connections to each other and deepened their understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. Standing in the same chapel where they had bid farewell to Philip, Catherine felt his presence in the values he had instilled, the example he had set, and the love he had brought to every aspect of his life. He was gone, but his influence would continue to shape the family and the institution he had served so faithfully. Elizabeth approached her after the service, taking her hand with a warmth that spoke to the deep bond that had developed between them. "Thank you," the Queen said simply, "for everything you've done these past weeks, for the support you've given William, for the love you've brought to our family. Philip saw something special in you from the beginning, and I understand now what he meant." Catherine felt the full weight of acceptance and belonging in those words. She had found her place in this extraordinary family, not just as William's wife, but as someone who understood the delicate balance between duty and love that defined their lives. As they walked back to the castle together, Catherine knew that while they would always miss Philip deeply, they would carry forward the lessons he had taught them about service, dedication, and the enduring power of love expressed through action. His legacy would live on in every life they touched, every cause they championed, and every moment they chose duty over ease, love over convenience, and service over self. The mourning period was ending, but the celebration of Philip's life through continued service was just beginning.